Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, well, we're joined now by Craig Mundie, president of Mundie and Associates, and also former Microsoft Chief Research and Strategy Officer, on location on Zoom in Washington, D.C. He's here to discuss his new book, Genesis: Artificial Intelligence, Hope and the Human Spirit. And this was co-authored with former Google CEO Eric Schmidt and the late Dr. Henry Kissinger. I want to get into the book and the future of AI and humanity, but I first want to ask Craig about just how this partnership of the three authors came together and the idea for writing this book.
It turned out I've known Henry for about, well, it would have been 27 years now. Back in the earlier days at Microsoft, we started to deal with a number of challenges on a global basis, and I was introduced to Henry, and we became fast friends that lasted another 25 years. And so we talked very regularly, almost twice a month. We'd sit and talk for a while. And that evolved about 5 or 6 years ago to a discussion more and more around artificial intelligence. Eric Schmidt, I've actually known since he was originally joined Sun Microsystems, so probably pushing toward 40 years now. And Eric and I, encountered each other in a number of ways and places. We both served President Obama as science advisors during his terms, and we got a chance via a meeting that we attended with Henry about 6 years ago to get Henry first exposed to what was happening in artificial intelligence. And he was, I guess, 94 at the time or something. But he was completely taken by, the issues that he thought would be created by the emergence of a super intelligence. And because his background was in philosophy and history, as well as diplomacy, he got more and more interested and involved in that. That led to Eric and Henry, and Dan Huttenlocker from MIT wrote a book a few years ago. We started to talk about the issues, but it didn't really talk so much about possible solutions. And the discussions I was having with Henry at the time were targeted a little more at this question of solutions than the very long-term issues. And that led to the three of us coming together and deciding to write a second book that would focus more on both the upsides and the strategy for how to manage the downsides. And that's Genesis.
Genesis, I guess, the beginning of this new era that we face. What I find most interesting is with the involvement of Henry Kissinger, then to me it means you can use artificial intelligence to do more things than like make Siri better, but maybe solve the Middle East conflict. And I wonder how AI would attempt to do something like achieve world peace. How would you use that tool to reach that goal?
Well, you chose an interesting word, tool. In the book, we talk about our view that over the long term, our involvement with and ultimately relationship with these super intelligent machines goes through three phases. First phase we're sort of in now is where we use it as a tool, much like we have in all the other inventions mankind has made. But we think this is the first one where things have to move beyond thinking of it as a tool that just amplifies our own capabilities. We call the second stage coexistence, where humans come to the realization that, in essence, these machines are like a new intelligent species. And in fact, it's probably super intelligent relative to humans. And while it's not a biological species in the way we normally think about it, it has sort of all those other properties. So that puts us in a situation where we want to think about how does this other intelligent species help us? And that brings on many new issues, philosophical, societal, and technological. And so, there's a lot of focus on that. Assuming we manage to get through that in a positive way and humans come out the other side, in kind of a new environment, then we end up in a stage we call coevolution, where, as has happened with biological species over the millennium on Earth, each of these things begins to affect the other, and you end up with some long-term symbiotic relationship. And while we can't really define what that'll be in advance, we expect that that's where this ultimately ends up. And so in that regard, at each of these points in time, how AI will affect everything, including diplomacy and international relations, as well as science and discovery and politics. We look at some of those issues specifically in the book, but I think in each of those three phases, the role that the AI plays in moving toward resolution, could be quite different.
The description of the book said that AI might well solve some of the greatest mysteries of our universe and elevate the human spirit to unimaginable heights. I'm wondering what the book, in this exploration of AI, actually teaches the reader about what it means to be human.
Well, one of the things that we point out in the book is that humanity is ultimately going to have to redefine the things that we think characterize humanity. We call in the book for the need to redefine dignity. Dignity as a base, of giving people sort of purpose and self-respect, we think is going to have to be rethought once the AI begins to not only be smarter than we are in virtually every field, but where the emergence of it in conjunction with robotics and a redistribution of work. In many ways, humans have always had to work in order to be able to survive. And in that environment, work becomes a big component of how they view themselves and produces dignity. And, as the AI and the evolving technical environment changes the relationship between work and humans, we're going to have to rethink what these things are. And so, the book tries to point to areas where we think the emergence of super intelligent machines will benefit humans in science and discovery and things like healthcare and education. But in the long run, it's really also a call for humans to come together with some urgency in order to be able to continue to redefine and utilize our own agency during this transitional period.
And do we continue to control this technology or this super intelligence? Because it sounds like in the final phase, it becomes near to omniscient and omnipotent, but I'm not sure that there's any reason it would be omnibenevolent. Like, I always think of the three properties of a Christian God. Is it really going to want to do good?
In the book, we talk about a new idea that's emerging in some quarters academically and a little bit, it's been the focus of my own work in this area, which is to try to think about how do we engineer the AI in such a way that, in fact, it does have a fundamental grounding in the same value systems that are important to humanity. Without that, you could say, and of course, many of the things that have been written in the last couple of years tend to be sensationalized, vis-a-vis the risk of the machine and the humans. And, our own view is that if we want to contain those risks, there's ultimately no way to do that other than by building a trusted way in which the AI itself is involved in policing its own actions. And we've come to believe that that's possible. And so if we can build this kind of trusted system that can monitor and to some extent control the use of all the other AIs collectively, then we think that we can avoid many of the downsides and get the full benefit of AI without suffering a substantial risk that the AI becomes basically adversarial to humanity.
Fascinating. Really fascinating stuff, Craig. And fantastic that you get a chance to write with Dr. Kissinger, his last piece of work, at least his last book. Craig Mundie, there on his book, Genesis, Artificial Intelligence, Hope, and the Human Spirit, which he wrote with Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt. Thanks very much for joining us. Let's talk right now about the environment and waste management, or now it's known as WM. We have Tara Hemmer right now out of Houston, Texas, joining us, Senior Vice President, Chief Sustainability Officer at WM. And as we look at the rising temperatures, the rising wind, natural disasters, how can WM, or waste management, help in this crisis?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it did take me a while to get used to the name change to WM. But it really is about the fact that WM, we handle so many different material types each and every day. And a lot of people don't know this about us. We are the largest recycler in North America, and we've made significant investments, announced a $1.4 billion investment in recycling infrastructure across North America from 2022 to 2026. And this is about bringing access to communities. Recycling is something that's so tangible and people can get their brains around, but there are some myths around recycling that we really want to work towards, so to speak, myth busting.
Yeah, I have to admit, I do recycle. However, I also typically will like a meme that has to do with the fact that, why am I recycling my yogurt container when, a CEO is taking a private jet 30 times a year? But I still recycle. But Tara, I'd love to hear kind of what your recent recycling report kind of showed about consumer perceptions of what the impact of recycling actually is, because sometimes when you put your yogurt container in the recycling bin, it really doesn't feel like you're doing much.
Right, that's right. Well, the most important, we did this study because we wanted to understand what are consumers' preferences and what's their understanding around recycling. And what we found was really fascinating. We found that consumers really are interested and want to know more about 4 key areas. They're interested in learning more about recycling. They want to be educated about what happens to their materials. They need more access to recycle. Some communities don't even have recycling as a service, and that's something that's incredibly important. And then what we also found is that consumer brands, there's a lot of brand pull from millennials. And so I'm so glad you brought up the example of yogurt containers, because when I meet people in my community or my neighborhoods, a lot of people are really interested in, can I recycle my yogurt container? And then what happens to it once it gets recycled? The thing is, we need to bring to life what happens to the materials that you put in the bin. A yogurt container in our world, it gets turned into paint cans, as an example. Or your water bottle that you might put in your recycling bin, it could get turned into another water bottle. It could get turned into apparel that you wear each and every day. In our case, it gets turned into our employees' uniforms. There's no greater circularity story than that. And in other instances, it gets turned into carpet that goes into homes. So it's important to know that if you are putting the right recycling types in your bin, it does get turned into other products. And the vast majority of it stays in the United States.
Right. Although there are a lot of caveats there. So by the way, this is the second time we've talked about yogurt on today's show. I think it's funny because there's so many SKUs, right? If you go to a grocery store, there's nothing they have more different kinds of than yogurt.
Right.
I typically eat Siggy's yogurt, and when I'm done with it, I'm always wondering, do I have to rinse the yogurt out of it before I put it in recycling? Do I need to rip off the paper label and put that in the paper recycling bin before I put my yogurt in the plastic recycling bin? And then when that all goes into the bins, what are the chances that the garbage men are actually going to take that stuff to recycling? Or are they all going to throw it, as I suspect, in the same giant bin that they throw all of the other garbage into, or sell it to a company that just ships it off to Indonesia and floats it in the ocean outside of Jakarta rather than recycling it. I think the transparency problem is a really big one. Tara, how do you overcome that?
Well, first and foremost, I want to underscore at WM, we take recycling extremely seriously. It's one of our more significant business lines. And when we collect your materials at the curb, it goes to a WM recycling facility or a recycling facility that we're vetting. And we have very sophisticated technology. I think this is something that people don't really understand. When you throw your yogurt container, your water bottle, your cardboard boxes from all the e-commerce shopping that we're doing, and you put it in one bin, single stream, we have advanced technology that sorts it out. So pulls out that cardboard container from all of the other things that it's commingled with. And we send it in a lot of instances to domestic markets. And that cardboard box might get turned into a pizza box that shows up in your local neighborhood. And regarding plastics, I've heard this from others too, like, do I rinse my material? I've heard of people putting their peanut butter jars through the dishwasher. Don't do that. From an environmental perspective, but also we want to have these materials mostly clean. And so if you can just, give it a quick rinse, that's great. But when it ends up at our facilities, we're still able to pick it out. And we work really hard to build markets for these materials. That's a big part of what we do. And I think the other reason why we did this study is there is a recognition that people are confused and they want to better understand where, if I'm doing all this work, where do my materials go?
Tara, we're going to have
something that from
we're running up against the clock, but we're going to have to have you come back because this really is fascinating stuff and interesting to hear what WM does and how dedicated you are. Tara Hemmer there, Senior Vice President, Chief Sustainability Officer at WM. This is Bloomberg.